So, yes, I'm going to talk about Kurt Gödel, who was a logician of the early 20th century. And I'm going to talk about him in the context, my interest and the context that I'm going to talk about him is looking at the nature of rationality and reason and proof. Okay? And what role does that have in the way we think about things and when we think about what we believe and what we don't believe? What role does rationality, reason, and proof have in the way we think about things? And the reason why Gödel is interesting to me is for two reasons. Number one, he was a famous logician, wrote a number of proofs, but one of them is called the Incompleteness Theorem. It's often referred to as the Incompleteness Theorem. And in the Incompleteness Theorem, what he showed was that it is absolutely impossible to prove that arithmetic has no contradictions. Okay? This was something everybody was working on for a long time. They wanted to come up with this system of arithmetic that was based on axioms, and they could prove that there were no contradictions in arithmetic whatsoever. And he showed that that task is impossible. Okay? This is often seen as sort of a destruction of the possibility of having certainty in mathematics. The other thing that is also really interesting and somewhat surprising is when he died, people were looking through his papers and they found an ontological proof for the existence of God. Okay, we're going to talk a lot more about that. So on the one hand, he's got this theorem which seems to destroy the possibility of certainty in mathematics, and at the same time, he's got this ontological proof of the existence of God. Curious fellow, to say the least. So I've got an outline. What I'm going to talk about here, I'll just briefly go through it. I'm going to talk about how we think about the question, can you prove that God exists? I'm going to look a little bit about the history of the ontological argument for the proof of God. I'm going to give a very, very brief and selective view of the development of our ideas of rationality and proof in culture, starting with the Enlightenment. I'm not going to go too far back. I'll just go back to the Enlightenment because that's where things really get interesting. And then I'm going to talk about Gödel and a little bit about him and his life and his results. And then I'm going to talk about how people responded to it. And I'm going to draw some conclusions. So that's the outline of how I'm planning on going. All right. So the current cultural response to can you prove the existence of God? Okay. So first let's just back up a little bit and ask ourselves about rationality and reason and proof and how do people think about that? I perceive, from my perspective, that there are kind of two different directions that people go, okay? One direction is that rationality, logic, and proof is more or less kind of the source of our problems. It's almost like the bad guy, okay? It can be used to sort of beat people into submission. You know, if you're I'm proving this to you, you have to believe it, kind of a thing. It can be used to avoid dialogue or open-mindedness. You know, I've proved it. There's no more things, nothing left to say. So it is also possibly used as a way of gaining power over somebody by using my reason. You know, you have to believe what I have to say. So that's kind of has people respond negatively to that kind of thing, it seems to me. On the other side, there are other people that for them, reason and rationality and proof are what is going to be a source of solutions for us and for our society, for us personally and for our society, that reason and rationality is the way to figure out what's true and what's right, okay? And so there may be, if there are problems, it's probably because people are being irrational or they're not thinking about things correctly. And if people thought rationally, we could sort that out. And, you know, if they are if they are distrusting reason, if they are not paying attention to reason, then they are susceptible to being, you know, misled or propagandized or something along those lines. So reason is a valuable tool and an important tool for figuring things out. So it seems like there are kind of two different directions that people are going with regard to how they think about that. And for most of us, I think it's sort of a little bit of both, maybe, or in between or something like that, that maybe both of those pieces are there at the same time. I don't know. But I do believe that when we think about proving and rationality, a lot of times it creates certain feelings in us. It creates a response in us. And I think trying to sort out why we think the things that we do about reason and rationality and logic, why is it that we have these responses? What is it that's going on? Where did those come from? What is going on in our culture that sort of leads us in that direction? Because I think some of those responses are culturally dependent. I think that's worth thinking about, and that's kind of what I'm doing here in this talk, is trying to look at and explore where did our responses to rationality and reason. And I think probably one of the places that you can go where the feelings are the most important or significant is if you ask to combine our beliefs about God and our beliefs about rationality and proof. So if we talk about the ontological proof for the existence of God, all of a sudden the question of rationality all of a sudden is really, it's keen, it's important. Can you prove that God exists? And if he does, do I have to believe him? Or can you not prove that he exists, et cetera, et cetera? That's an important question. All of a sudden, it brings it to the fore, it brings it to a head in some sense. So that's kind of why this is an interesting juxtaposition of Gödel's Incompleteness Theorem and his ontological proof of the existence of God. So I think that if you ask almost everybody, except for maybe, I don't know, maybe there are some people that would not believe this. Can you prove that God exists? Everybody is going to say, no, you can't prove that, right? The atheists for certain are going to say that you can't prove the existence of God. But I would even say that the Christians would also more or less agree that you can't prove the existence of God. And so if you were to probe why do we believe that you cannot prove the existence of God, I would say that there are a variety of reasons. These are not all the reasons. These are just three that I happen to pick out that I think might go through people's heads. One of the reasons is that the only place that proof is applicable is in things like math and science. Sure, you can prove things in math, right? That's what they do in math. I mean, we don't do that anymore. I don't do that. Nobody does that. But those mathematician guys, they prove things, right? And the scientists, they prove things as well. But God, no. That's not math. God's not science. We don't prove things about God. Another reason people might say that you cannot prove the existence of God is that if you could prove the existence of God, that would nullify faith, that we would no longer need to believe in God. This is drawn from a perspective that might say that there is something to my credit to believe in spite of the evidence, in some sense, that if I just believe, I don't have to have reasons to believe. I don't have to have a proof or evidence or anything like that. That it's to my credit if I am willing to just take that leap of faith, maybe a misinterpretation of Kierkegaard's leap of faith. We talk about that around here a lot. Or, if you can prove the existence of God, somehow it takes away our freedom to choose God or something along those lines. Or even, it's a part of our faith to believe in God, but the atheists, since you can't prove that God doesn't exist, it's part of their faith as well, so they're just in the same boat as us or something like this. This might be one of the kinds of responses that Christians might have to this question. It's not necessarily the response that everybody would have, but it seems like it might be a response that we could have. A third reason why people might not believe that the proof of the existence of God is possible is that proof is, in fact, pointless. There is no point to proving things. That reason is not reliable. Truth is not accessible. We can't figure it out. And furthermore, even if there were proofs, people don't really base their decisions or thinking on logic and proof. They decide things on totally other grounds other than reasonable grounds, or that we really are left with personal choice. this is kind of a devaluing of the role of reason and proof I think, and I think that there is a strain of that in our culture at the moment. So that might be a reason why there's no possibility for the proof for the existence of God. I mean, there's always the possibility that people don't want there to be a proof for the existence of God, but I don't think that very many people would own up to that as a reason why there's no proof for the existence of God. But that's always a possibility. But I think maybe there are other reasons. Maybe there are other really good reasons here as to why people don't think that there could be a proof for the existence of God. But I think that it is. I've never heard anybody say, yes, I've heard of a proof for the existence of God, and it's a good one. Never heard that. I don't know. Maybe there are people that think that. All right. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk about the history of this ontological argument for the existence of God. All right. I'm going to start in the medieval period. And one of the things I'm going to do 3 periods. I'm going to do the medieval period, the Enlightenment period, and then I'm going to talk about Gödel, who's in the early 20th century. We could probably put him smack in the middle of a modern period. And in each of these periods, I'm going to talk about each of these sections of time. I'm going to talk about what they think of by when they're talking about proof. What do they mean by proof, right? So I think in the medieval period, and again, I haven't really studied this very carefully. I'm just sort of going from my gut, and I don't even know. Yeah, well, I'll just say. I think that for the medieval period, a proof tended to be kind of an argument where you started with certain premises. It was a persuasive argument. If people bought the premises and they bought the argument, then they would come to the conclusion that it was true. And if you think of it as a persuasive argument, that a proof is really a persuasive argument, I want to keep that in mind, and I'm going to contrast that to what I think sort of evolved when we start thinking about proof and that kind of thing when you get to the Enlightenment period. I may be wrong about that medieval picture, but let's talk about Anselm. Anselm is the celebrated originator for this thing called the ontological argument for the existence of God. So I thought it would be worthwhile to just sort of lay it out here so everybody could see exactly what the argument is. It's something like this. I mean, there's a variety of different versions, and I've sort of simplified it possibly. God is defined as, this is we're going to say, what we mean by the word God is the greatest possible being that can be imagined. Okay, so we've got a scale of greatness, right? There's beings that can be imagined here, and then there are beings that can be imagined that are greater here, and beings that can be imagined that are greater here, and at the very end, there's the being that is the greatest possible being that can be imagined. Okay, so we got the greatness scale. Then we say God exists as an idea in the mind. All right? Certainly we can imagine God exists as an idea of the mind. Then we're going to claim that existing in reality, okay, is greater than existing in the mind. So now we're on our greatness scale here. Things that don't exist in reality are lower in the scale, and things that do exist in the reality are higher in the scale. So if it's going to be existing in reality, it's definitely on the higher side of greatness, right? Now let's assume for the moment that God does not exist in reality, right? If he does not exist in reality, that means he's been bumped down in the greatness scale a little bit, because something that did exist in reality would be greater than God. But what was our definition of God? Our definition of God was the greatest possible being that we can imagine. So somewhere we've got this contradiction. We've got a being that is not the greatest, who is also at the same time the greatest, which is a contradiction. So somewhere we made a mistake. Presumably the mistake was that we assumed that God does not exist in reality. Therefore, that assumption must be wrong. Therefore, we have proved that God must exist in reality. Okay? That's the proof. That's how it goes. That's more or less how it runs. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into details on this proof. I'm not going to go a lot of time into Leibniz's proof or Gödel's proof or anything. I'm just sort of giving you a bit of an overview here. But it is interesting, somebody like Alvin Plantinga comes along, who's a theologian, a modern 20th century, well, he was a 20th century theologian. He says, at first sight, Anselm's argument is remarkably unconvincing, if not downright irritating. It looks too much like a parlor puzzle or word magic. As a result, despite its enduring importance, the ontological argument has brought few people to theism. I think that's probably true. Everybody looks at that and go, oh, really? That works? I don't know. Me, that seems kind of weird. I don't know. I think that is the common response to that kind of thing. Feels like a word puzzle or something weird like that. Okay, let's move on to the Enlightenment period. All right. So this is 1600s, early 1700s. There's a bunch of people for whom reason and rationality is valuable. And we have a number of people that are responding to Anselm. They're either disagreeing with Anselm's argument or agreeing with it or trying to take it from a different perspective, looking at it a different way. One of those was Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz. And he is sort of the epitome of the Enlightenment thinker. I mean, he was Mr. Rationality, if you will. He wanted to prove everything from first principles that were obvious and intuitively knowable. And he obviously is going to respond to this ontological argument. He says his proof is something like, the necessary being exists, that is, a being whose essence is existence, or a being which exists of itself, as is clear from the terms. Now God is such a being, by definition of God. Therefore, God exists. I don't know if that's any better, but that was Leibniz's approach to the whole thing, all right? But not very many people found Leibniz's proof any more convincing than Anselm's. So Gödel comes along, and he's a logician. Who's his very favorite person? Well, he's got two. He's got two favorite authors from the past. One of them is Immanuel Kant, but the other one is Leibniz. He loves Leibniz. He reads all of Leibniz all the time. He's got him down. So he sees Leibniz's ontological argument, and he's a logician, and he goes, I wonder if I could firm that up. I assume that's what he was thinking. I don't know. He never wrote much about it. But he creates a proof as well, okay? I forgot to describe what I think proof means in the Enlightenment period. Remember how we talked about in the medieval period, for Anselm, a proof was a persuasive argument? I think that we get to the Enlightenment period, it shifts just a little bit. The way they're thinking about proof, or the thing that they're wanting, is to have something which is undoubtable, 100% certain, which is unassailable in any way, which nobody could possibly doubt or find any criticism or problem with, right? So you've heard of Descartes is the classic. He's the poster boy for 100% certainty, right? You know, he throws away every possible idea that you could have and concludes the only thing that I cannot throw away is that I must exist because I'm thinking, you know, the I think therefore I am kind of thing. Leibniz is in the same park. He's looking for 100% proof, 100% certain proof. When we get to Gödel, we're shifting again the nature of proof a little bit. One of the things that is common between the medieval and the Enlightenment period is that these proofs that they're talking about are proofs about reality, about truth. We want to prove things that are real and true. When you get to Gödel's period, maybe not Gödel himself, but there were a lot of people for whom a proof was kind of a game. It was like you state certain premises and you follow rules, and if you follow the rules, you come to a conclusion, and the conclusion, therefore, is proved based on the premises and the rules that you started with, right? And that's what a proof is. If that premises have absolutely nothing to do with reality or truth, well, who cares? What we're doing is we're doing the game of proving from first principles, okay? So that was the kind of the way that the idea of proof was in the minds of a lot of people at the time of Gödel. So he comes along and he creates this proof, and he uses words in his proof like necessary, possible, property, these sorts of words. He's expanding the kind of logic, which was the traditional kind of logic where you have if then kinds of statements and therefore and all this is that and is included in and is part of all those kinds of logic words. Probable or possible or necessary, these are new words that are brought into logic, and the logic that uses these kinds of words is called modal logic. I wasn't really familiar with, but apparently modal logic, and it's used for proving things about systems. He uses modal logic of some sort in his incompleteness theorem. He's proving things about a mathematical system is a use of modal logic as well. And people study this kind of thing, and people have looked at the proof that he put together. I'm not going to try and even give you any kind of indication of what his proof looked like, because I read it and I said, I can't make heads or tails of it. And if I can't make heads or tails of it, I probably won't be able to explain it to you so that you can make heads or tails of it. So I'm going to skip over it, all right? Just assume that it's too complicated for us mere mortals to understand. He was that kind of guy. Anyway, so people have looked through this modal logic, and more or less everybody has agreed that he didn't make any mistakes in his proof. Although there are plenty of criticisms of his proof in that they disagree with the assumptions that he's made somewhere along the line. So the premises maybe they don't agree with or something along those lines. So there have been criticisms of Gödel's proof, but it has received quite a bit of attention. And everybody agrees that there's at least the way he did it, he didn't make any mistakes in his logical steps as he's going through. All right, there you have it. That's a little bit of a history of the ontological argument. It's not like that's the full history of the ontological argument. There have been a lot more people who have talked about it. There are people today that are writing books about it and responding to Gödel and responding to other people and so on and so forth. All right, so next I'm gonna do a little brief overview of the culture's perspective of rationality and reason and proof, starting with the Enlightenment period and coming forward to now. And the reason why I'm going to do this is because I think it's useful to have this kind of a framework for understanding why we respond the way we do to the proof for the existence of God. For those of you who are familiar with this stuff, it's going to be very old, it's very broad, you've heard it all before, there's nothing new here, but I think it might be helpful, a brief helpful review. So, start with the Enlightenment period. In the Enlightenment period, 1600s, 1700s, rationality is king. Okay? Why is rationality king? Why is everybody so excited about the possibility of learning things from rationality? Well, they are responding to things. This is what I have found in all of my studies of Western civilization is everybody who writes anything is responding to the guy who came before and said, you're an idiot. All right? So they are looking back in the past and they're going, there's a lot of problems in the past. We're looking at what the scholastics were doing, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. They are looking at, Aristotle's system, and people are finding problems with Aristotle's systems. I mean, the biggest problem that people are finding is that Aristotle said the Earth was the center of the solar system, and now we're finding out that's not the case. There are lots of other problems with Aristotle's systems that they're finding. Furthermore, there's the Reformation. The Bible is, the church is no longer the authority that it was. So there's a big change in what's going on. And then I think probably one of the things that was most influential, I'm maybe a little biased here, but I think the thing that was most influential in driving the Enlightenment was the series of religious wars that broke out in the 1600s. So the Lutherans were fighting the Catholics, who were fighting the Anabaptists, who were fighting the Calvinists, who were fighting whoever they were fighting. They were all fighting, and they were having wars, and they were bloody. And there were situations where, so-and-so prince was in charge of this area, and everybody that was a Lutheran was great, and then his son or whatever ascends the throne or whatever, and this person is now Catholic, and now we're persecuting all the poor Lutherans that used to be in charge of all the places, and they all have to run away if they're or change to Catholic. It was a mess. All right, so there was a lot of, and so people are looking out there and they're going, well, you know, I don't think that we can figure out what's really right and true by looking at the Bible because everybody disagrees. We need a better standard than just reading the Bible to figure out what's right. And what is the standard that we have available that we are now developing that Isaac Newton used to solve the solar system problem that other people are looking at as great? Reason. Reason is the key. So that's why reason is the king here. All right, so I'm moving on from the Enlightenment period. I'm moving into the modern period, which is like the mid 1800s. Okay, so around the 19th century, that kind of thing. So what starts happening here, and this is not everywhere, and it's not in everything, but it's fairly pervasive, is sort of this anti-metaphysical kind of a vibe that gets created in culture. So what does anti-metaphysical mean? It means that we're kind of getting rid of things which have to do with God or angels or, certain principles, timeless, necessary principles of the world, Plato's forms, if you're familiar with that kind of a thing. All of these metaphysical principles that exist that are not here and now, that are not physical, that are not material, that are not natural, all those sorts of things. That is stuff that is sort of on the outs. And what's on the ins are things like rationalism and naturalism and materialism and things like that. So in physics and science, they are using something called logical positivism. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but basically it says we can use mathematical reasoning and we can use empirical evidence. Those are the only two things that we can use, and everything that cannot be described or understood in terms of empirical evidence and mathematics is not worth talking about. It is metaphysical, and we're going to throw it out. Sociology, we have a guy named Comte who is arguing that we used to be in a theological stage, and then we went into a metaphysical stage, and now we are in the positive stage. And the positive stage is characterized by science and rationality. And we are going to use the science of humanity, the science of man, which he calls sociology, to understand who man is and how man should behave and work among themselves. We also have technology that is developing. People are figuring all kinds of things, and the rise of technology is coming along. Even in religion, there is an abandonment of metaphysics in some of the German higher criticism. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with this kind of thing, but one of the things that they were trying to throw out were things like miracles, which were not understandable or acceptable to the modern person because they were metaphysical or not rational, that sort of thing. So we're throwing out miracles and things of that sort. Psychology, we're seeing humanity, a human is no longer, it's not so much that he has a spirit or a mind. We're seeing him more as a biological machine who has repressed kinds of things that are going on inside of his brain and brain waves, things of that sort, although that comes a little bit later. Biology, the world is explained by naturalistic causes with Darwin as opposed to theological arguments, which is more metaphysical. So there's that shift as well in biology. History, we're moving more towards archaeology, which is more scientific way of understanding what our history is rather than necessarily relying on people who wrote about things. Basically, we're looking for the austere heights of reason and math and things of that sort, and we are getting rid of all that nasty metaphysics. We're throwing it away, all right? As you can imagine, in this anti-metaphysical vibe that we are pushing on people, there were reactions, and there were lots of reactions, and the reactions were rather extreme. I'm going to name 3 reactions because they're interesting to me. One of them, a reaction to the Enlightenment period even, is called Romanticism. Romanticism were a glorification of nature, the sublime, beauty, subjectivity, things of that sort. It was very, very significant in the artistic world, in music and literature and poetry and all sorts of things, the arts. So Romanticism says, wait, that reason thing is leaving me cold. I don't like it. I think that there's a lot more to life than just this cold, hard, rational way of thinking about things. Another reaction, I think, to this anti-metaphysical vibe that was going around was Christian fundamentalism. Okay? Well, the Christians are looking around and they're going, well, all these smart academic guys, these people in the universities, what are they saying? They're saying God didn't create the man or the creatures or whatever. It was from Darwin. And they're saying they're throwing metaphysics out and they're throwing miracles out of the Bible, and they're thinking about science and math as opposed to God. I mean, the chief metaphysical bad guy for the modern period was God himself. So they're like, we don't need that. We don't need the academy. The academy is not where it's at. We're going to reject, in some sense, not just the academy and their conclusions, but reason itself in some sense. And we are going to focus on the Bible and what it says. We're going to maintain certain core doctrines, and we are going to reject sort of the anti-metaphysical vibe that is going on there. We have belief in spite of all of the things that the academy is saying, that kind of thing. All right. A third reaction that came somewhat later, but definitely is still around today, is what I would call the postmodern period. At this point, what people are saying is they're looking at the way people operate and they're saying, well, even rationality, the way people do rationality and the way they think about things is dependent on the culture that they are in and the way they grow up and the kind of arguments they make. It depends on your framework for how you see things and think about things. It depends on the language that you're using. It depends on your paradigm, the way you're putting things together. Different cultures are coming at things in different ways. And so this universal reason that is the same for all mankind is not really so universal after all. There's a lot of different approaches, and it doesn't seem like that reason is necessarily going to be the thing that is going to achieve the truth. And this kind of a vibe, and I'm probably not doing it justice, but this kind of a perspective is very, very influential in all sorts of different areas in the academy still. Language, politics, sociology, science, ethics, literature. I mean, it's kind of everywhere. And it's what it's doing is it's taking the authority of reason and rationality and it's reducing it. It's saying, not so sure that it is a reliable source, that kind of a thing. All right. So hopefully I didn't butcher those periods too badly. You guys can correct me when we get to the question and answer period. All right. So let's talk about Gödel. Gödel is born in 1906 in the Czech Republic. He lives in Austria most of his life. He leaves Austria and comes to the United States right before World War II because of the danger there for Jews. He was not a Jew, but there was a lot of things that are going on, and there was some people mistook one of his family members for a Jew. So he leaves there and he goes and he lands in Princeton, New Jersey at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study. He was a collaborator of Einstein. Apparently they took walks most days. So they were good buddies. Very logical brain. He was really good at mathematics, really good at physics. He apparently, so the best way to know about Gödel is through anecdotes. I love the Gödel anecdotes. There's so many of them, so I'll share a few of them. I don't know how many of them are exactly true, but I think many of them are. Apparently, when he was doing Latin in school, they reported that he never made a mistake in his grammar in Latin. Hard to believe, but well. He apparently was very confident of his conclusions, but not arrogant. So he felt pretty confident about his things. He tended to self-diagnose his own health problems because he had many health problems throughout his whole life, starting at the age of 4. So his brother, who was a doctor, said he was an absolutely wretched patient because he was always figuring out what was wrong with himself and not listening to his doctor. In 1948, he came for a citizenship exam, and he was coming up before the judge, and people were a little concerned that he was going to say something crazy, and so the judge is asking him some questions at some point, and somewhere along the line an opening comes up, and he tells the judge that he thinks that there is a logical flaw in the Constitution, and that under certain circumstances, a president could turn it into a dictatorship. All right. So this is the kind of mind he had. There was this little loophole that he found in the Constitution where it could into dictatorship. He apparently got his citizenship anyway. Here's a couple of, he also, unfortunately, in his end of his life, he became somewhat paranoid, very paranoid, and he was afraid people were trying to so he wouldn't eat. And so he eventually died of malnutrition, in fact. Here is some really fun anecdotes from a book called Incompleteness by Rebecca Goldstein. I'm just reading these off. John Bacall was a promising young astrophysicist when he was introduced to Gödel at a small institute dinner. He identified himself as a physicist, to which Gödel's curt response was, "I don't believe in natural science." The philosopher Thomas Nagel recalled also being seated next to Gödel at a small gathering for dinner at the Institute and discussing the mind-body problem with him, a philosophical chestnut that both men had tried to crack. Nagel pointed out to Gödel that Gödel's extreme dualist view, according to which souls and bodies have quite separate existences, linking up with one another at birth to conjoin in a sort of partnership that is severed upon death, seems hard to reconcile with the theory of evolution. Gödel professed himself a non-believer in evolution and topped this off by pointing out, as if this were additional corroboration for his own rejection of Darwinism, Stalin didn't believe in evolution either, and he was a very intelligent man. After that, Nagel told me with a small laugh, "I just gave up." The last one, the linguist Noam Chomsky, too, reported being stopped dead in his linguistic tracks by the logician. Chomsky asked him what he was currently working on and received an answer that probably nobody since the 17th century's Leibniz had given. "I am trying to prove that the laws of nature are a priori." In other words, they are based out of reason and rationality as opposed to empirical study. So he is an odd guy. He has very odd commitments, but two of his primary commitments through his whole life are realism and rationalism. A Platonic realism that says concepts, especially mathematical concepts, exist objectively independent of human minds, or culture or language. He thought that materialism, which was sort of the opposite of Platonism, was false. Okay? His second main commitment was rationalism. The world is rational, according to Gödel. There is much to know through the pursuit of rationality and the use of logic. This is true not only of mathematics, but of science and theology and philosophy. He had a desire to apply the precision of logic to the language of philosophy and theology in particular. Okay, so very rational, very realistic, which is why the title was Gödel as One Untimely Born. He was in the wrong time period. If he had grown up in Leibniz's day, he would have been a hero. And he grew up in this period where realism, Platonic realism, and rationalism were on the outs. So he was in the wrong time period. All right, so let's give you just a little bit of context for his incompleteness theorem. Okay, remember I started with the incompleteness theorem, which said that it is impossible to prove that arithmetic does not have any contradictions. Okay, there was another piece to it, which I'll go into in a little bit. So there were a number of guys that were writing about mathematics at this period of time in the late 1800s, the very early 1900s. I'll list their names. One of them was Frege, Gottlob Frege. Another one was Bertrand Russell, you may have heard of. Whitehead, Hilbert, nobody's ever heard of Hilbert, but he was a very famous mathematician of the 20th century. And Wittgenstein, who was actually a math student of Bertrand Russell in England for a while. And what their goal was to provide a sure and certain foundation for mathematics, okay? We've had a lot of mathematics prior to this time, and everybody's been using it, and we've been getting all these great results, and we've been studying physics with it, and it's applied and all this other stuff, but we need a sure foundation. We need to have it really well formed. So the way they're going to do that is with axiomatics. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of axiomatics, but basically axiomatics is the idea is that you start with first principles, very basic principles, very obvious principles, okay? Principles that everybody presumably is going to accept, and rules, and you use the principles and rules and you derive results from the rules. It's all derived from those basic axioms and rules, and no step is ever allowed that isn't, you don't have a rule that allows you to do this. For those students that we inflict Euclid on, they're very familiar with this process of starting with postulates and then proving things from the postulates until you get to this large superstructure of mathematics. So the key is, if you're not making mistakes in your creation of your superstructure, the key is starting with really good axioms, right? You want to start with the most basic, the most fundamental axioms that everybody can agree on. So there are some people that chose logic as the fundamental axioms. This was Russell and Whitehead, and they wrote this huge book called Principia Mathematica, which nobody reads, but everybody references. And they based all of arithmetic on these logical axioms of just basic logic principles, okay? Another guy, Hilbert, said, no, all right? You do not want to base your principles on logic. What you want to do is everybody has a free choice to choose whatever principles or whatever axioms you want. Freely chosen. The only criteria that you want to do is you would like to pick axioms that are going to allow you to have a fruitful superstructure above it. If you pick lousy axioms, you're not going to get very far. Or if you pick contradictory axioms, you're going to go along a little while and you're going to get a contradiction somewhere along the line. So you don't want to pick those, but you're free to pick them however you want, right? So you want to pick good ones, but you're free to pick them, all right? It is not the case that we're picking our axioms because they correspond to the real world. It's not because we actually use addition and subtraction when we're counting sheep and cows or anything like that, or when we're doing our books or anything like that. That's not really where they come from. It's not because of any experience that we have or correspondence to reality of any sort. This is pure math. Mathematics removed from correspondence with reality is what they were working on, okay? It turned out, and what is it that you're working with? You're working with symbols. So it's a game of symbols in some sense, okay? It turned out, as they were doing this, that they ran into a few problems, okay? Some of the axioms allowed for very strange kinds of self-referential structures in their math. And when they got these self-referential structures, they ran into these paradoxes and contradictions. So they're like, we've got to pick better axioms. We've got to figure out what our axioms are, what we really need to do. And then it occurred to them, what we really need to do is we don't know that arithmetic is true because it corresponds to the reality of the world. What we want to prove that arithmetic, that the axioms that we have chosen are not going to have any contradictions ever. We need to prove that you can't have any contradictions ever from our basic set of axioms. That's what they wanted to prove. That was the big thing. And everybody's like, yes, we're going to do that. We're going to prove that our axioms create this consistent system, and furthermore, it's complete. And by complete, they meant that every question in arithmetic that can be posed can be answered either yes or no. So those were the criteria for a really good axiomatic system. Bertrand Russell quipped when he was talking about mathematics, he said, mathematics may be defined as the subject in which we never know what we are talking about, nor whether what we are saying is true. It's because all they're dealing with is symbols, and the symbols don't correspond to anything. So I thought that was an interesting quote. All right, so that's the context, the mathematical context that Gödel is growing up in. All right, he's reading this stuff. He's reading Principia Mathematica by Russell. He's reading this stuff by Hilbert. He also is participating in something referred to as the Vienna Circle. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this. It's an interesting group that was formed in Vienna in the early 1900s by a bunch of guys. They were academics, and they would get together every once in a while and talk about academic subjects and present papers. And there were famous ones and less famous ones. And one of the most famous ones was the Vienna Circle. A couple of guys named Hahn and Schlick were in charge, and it was quite well attended. It was sort of like in Vienna, the who's who of smart guys were all going to this Vienna Circle. And Gödel's advisor was Hahn, and he invited Gödel to come to this Vienna Circle. And these guys were working on logical positivism. I mentioned it earlier. Logical positivism says that only things which could be verified empirically or analyzed logically were meaningful. Okay? Everything else was not worth discussing. So we're throwing out all the metaphysics, and they were really interested in pursuing the empirical, pursuing the logical, that kind of stuff like that. All right. So Gödel is part of this group. He's listening to these guys. And what is he? He's like a realist and a rationalist, remember? And these guys, they're like throwing out a whole bunch of stuff. So he thought, I'm gonna look at this question of whether or not arithmetic can be proven to be consistent. And so he starts working on this problem that nobody else has been able to solve, right? Young guy, early 20s, all right? He starts working on it, and he invents a bunch of stuff in order to make this proof. He comes up with if you're going to prove a system doesn't have any contradictions, how are you going to do that, right? You need to make statements about the mathematical system, okay? If you're making statements about a mathematical system, we're going into the realms of modal logic, if you remember modal logic, where you have probable and necessary and that kind of thing like that. And you want to take these statements about the mathematical system and turn them into statements in the mathematical system. So let me give you a distinction between statements in the mathematical system and statements about the mathematical system. A statement in the mathematical system would be 2 + 2 = 4, right? That's an arithmetical statement, right? That's arithmetic. A statement about the mathematical system would be something like 2 + 2 = 4 is a provable formula, right? 2 + 2 = 4 is a provable formula. That's not something that they teach you in arithmetic. It's not part of arithmetic. It's a statement about arithmetic, all right? So he came up with a scheme to take statements about the system and put them into the system by converting these statements into weird numbers called Gödel numbers, all right? So I am not going to go into any more detail than that. Let's just say he invents these weird methods in which he is able to convert statements about the system to put them into arithmetic, and then he does all this weird logic, and he finally, after all this hard stuff, which it's complicated. Let's say that. If you guys are interested, I can point you to a book that talks about it. It's a really interesting book, Gödel's Proof. But in the end, he comes to two conclusions. All right? Number one, if there are no contradictions, then there are questions that cannot be answered, i.e. a system is not complete. There are some questions that you will never be able to tell whether the answer is yes or no, true or false, correct or incorrect. There are some problems that you just can't solve in arithmetic if the system is consistent, okay? It's not saying it is consistent, but if it is, there are unsolvable problems, all right? That's a bummer for a mathematician. Mathematicians don't like that. They like problems to be solved. Second, this is the tough one. you cannot prove that there are no contradictions. Well, that is a real bummer for Hilbert and Russell and guys like that, because what they really wanted was they wanted to be able to prove that mathematics, that arithmetic had no contradictions. And here Gödel comes along and he says, sorry guys, it can't be done. This is the incompleteness theorem. You cannot prove arithmetic is without contradictions, all right? Most people saw this as the demise, in some sense, of the possibility of certainty in mathematics. Kind of a big deal. It was not known for a long time, but it became more and more of a big deal. All right. So I am moving on now. I know I didn't give you hardly anything about how he proved his proof, but in order to do that, I would have had to spend the whole entire time just setting it up and describing the things, and then you guys all would have been like, what is he talking about? Why is he talking about that? It's not worth the effort, okay? If you want to do it, I encourage you to, and I can point you in the direction and even walk you through it, but not here. All right. So conclusions. How do people respond to Gödel's incompleteness theorem? All right. Well, given the age, let's remind ourselves the age that we are in, early 20th century. All right. Remember, metaphysics is out. We're not having metaphysics anymore. The enlightened European states, the result of all this wonderful enlightenment that we have had, just went through World War I and, just slaughtered each other in the most heinous and miserable of ways. People are looking at that and going, I'm not sure they were so enlightened, okay? We also have Newtonian physics, which was some of the diamonds of rationality and truth and proof that everybody said at least Newton is right, right? At least Newton is right. He got it right. We've got the solar system. We've got laws of motion. That is good, solid stuff. And what do we have? Relativity theory. We have quantum mechanics, space and time, and causality, and position, and momentum. All of these concepts are now thrown out, or at least changed. All right? Metaphysics is out, enlightenment is out, science, even Newton is out, and mathematics is not certain either. Man, we are in serious trouble. Even mathematics is out. This is the way people are sort of taking this kind of stuff in, I think. It's not everywhere, but it certainly starts to make itself felt, especially in the academic community, and then spreads out to the rest of the rest of the world. The Enlightenment, folks, is dead as far as most people are concerned. It is dead as a doornail. All right. So, what about Gödel? What does he think about this? Does he think that this is the result that one should take from his theorem, that there is no place for rationality? All right. So I have a variety of things I am going to read from an essay that he wrote about mathematics in the light of philosophy. All right. He says, he's going to sort of characterize how he thinks things are going here. He says, I believe that the most fruitful principle for gaining an overall view of the possible worldviews will be to divide them according to the degree and manner of their affinity to, or respectively, turning away from metaphysics or religion. Remember, metaphysics was a key concept at the time, right? In this way, we immediately obtain a division into two groups, okay? Boy, I have to figure this out. Okay, I'm gonna do it according to you guys, because he splits them into right and left, and I want to make sure that I'm going to your right and your left. Okay, here we go. So he says skepticism and materialism and positivism stand on one side. Okay, that's the left, and spiritualism, idealism, and theology on the other. That's what he's going to call the right. Okay, this is very optimistic. This is very pessimistic. This has idealism, theology, eternal truths. This has just material, it's the here and now, that kind of stuff over here. He says, Now, it is a familiar fact, even a platitude, that the development of philosophy since the Renaissance has, by and large, gone from right to left, i.e. from optimism and knowledge to pessimism. It would truly be a miracle if this, I would like to say rabid, development had not also begun to make itself felt in the conception of mathematics. And then I put in some sections here that I wrote. Mathematics is inclined to the right. I'm summarizing. But in accordance with the spirit of the age, Hilbert attempted a leftward move in mathematics. And yet, based on his theorem, the Hilbertian combination of materialism and aspects of classical mathematics thus proves impossible. So Hilbert tried to sort of take mathematics to the left, right? This is the left for you guys. He's taking mathematics to the left by removing it from the real world, by turning it into just purely symbolic manipulation, and we're not talking about truth anymore. All we're talking about is being able to make conclusions based on axioms. All right. Hence, only two possibilities remain open. One must either give up the old rightward aspects of mathematics. Mathematics has always been very rightward. It's very truth-oriented. It's very principle-oriented. It's very eternal, timeless conclusions kind of thing. So in principle, mathematics is usually rightward. So we can give up the old rightward aspects of mathematics or attempt to uphold them in contradiction to the spirit of the time. Obviously, the first course is the only one that suits our time and is therefore also the one usually adopted. One should, however, keep in mind that this is a purely negative attitude. One simply gives up aspects whose fulfillment would in any case be very desirable and which have much to recommend themselves, namely, on the one hand, to safeguard for mathematics the certainty of its knowledge, and on the other, to uphold the belief that for clear questions posed by reason, reason can also find clear answers. And, as should be noted, one gives up these aspects not because the mathematical results achieved compel one to do so, but because that is the only possible way, despite these results, to remain in agreement with the prevailing philosophy. So what Gödel, I think, is trying to say here is that this pessimistic attitude, the conclusions that people are drawing, that mathematics is somehow dead, that we don't have certainty, is a conclusion which is in keeping with the spirit of the age, which is anti-metaphysical and pessimistic and materialistic and all that kind of stuff like that. But it's not necessary. He says there are other ways of talking about rationality. There are other ways of delving into these questions other than this strange one that Hilbert had created where we've divorced mathematics from reality. There are other ways of engaging in mathematics which can uphold certainty, and we can make results, come up with results and success with these kinds of things. So Gödel was not, I think the thing that is so ironic was Gödel was in this Vienna circle, and he was surrounded by these guys that were completely promoting the spirit of the age. And here's this young 22-year-old guy, that may not be his age, but he was in his early 20s. This young guy, this brilliant logician, comes along and he shares this theorem. And they're like, and the reason why he wants to share it is not because he is in keeping with their philosophy, but to say, you know, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Your hopes of finding some certainty in mathematics, of grounding everything in, you know, these axioms and stuff, that's not the right way to go. There are other better ways. So he kind of proves this proof in order to show them that their whole scheme of trying to build stuff on axioms and stuff like that, that the move to the left that they have chosen is not really a good scheme. That's the way he was thinking about it, I think, if I understand correctly, what he was doing with this thing. And I think it's ironic that here he is in the middle of Vienna Circle, and he proves this proof that sort of kind of destroys their whole basis for existence in some sense. All right, conclusions. I want to go back now. We've gone through this whole thing. I want to go back to the very beginning where we talked about proof for the existence of God, right? And I want to look at the various reasons why we all thought, or why I suggested, that a proof for the existence of God was not possible. The first one was science, right? Science is the thing that deals with proofs. Well, if you think a little about what I've been talking about, the idea that only science is the thing that deals with proofs sounds a lot like this modernism, this anti-metaphysical kind of vibe that comes out. It's this perspective that the only thing that is real, the only thing that we can talk about are math and scientific things and empirical things, and those are the things that are susceptible to proof and knowledge and objectivity and things of that sort. And all that metaphysical stuff, that's all opinion, and you can't really come to any real provable knowledge with regard to that. That split, that perspective, that modernist perspective, I think, influences, I would say, the way we think about the question whether or not a proof is applicable to anything other than science and math. Can you prove things other than in science and math? I would say there is a stream from our cultural history that says, no, the only thing that you can prove is science and math. And that stream is, in my opinion, a philosophical bias. It is a reaction to things of the past. It is a perspective that was developed through the history of ideas. Okay? The second reason why we might not believe in the proof of the existence of God is that it nullifies faith. Okay? I might be stepping on dangerous ground here, but I would say that that perspective comes somewhat out of sort of the fundamentalism reaction to the moderns, right? There was this fundamentalist reaction to the academia and science and knowledge and proof and reason and all that kind of stuff, and they backtracked and pulled back and said, we are going to have faith anyway, and we are going to stand upon our faith, and we are going to be good with it, right? And there was a bit of that reaction, and I feel like maybe that kind of pulling back still affects our culture in some sense, that to think that there would be a proof for the existence of God would somehow lower or minimize our faith and the importance of us believing in God in some sense. I don't know. You guys can disagree with me. I may be all wet, but that's a possibility. And then the third one is that proof is pointless, that it is outmoded. Rationality is not reliable. I think this one comes from postmodernism, okay, which is reacting in some sense to the vibe of modernism and the Enlightenment. It is a reaction in some sense. I don't think that any of the reactions that we're talking about here, whether it be modernism or fundamentalism or postmodernism or even romanticism, that one's not listed here, but none of those are necessarily, there's always something good in the reactions, but they are typically reactions that drive the whole culture in a particular direction and give us a lens or a framework with which we look at the nature of proof and rationality. And the postmodern vision is that rationality is not really all that reliable, in my opinion. And so that comes, I think, also from a cultural reaction. It is a philosophical bias in some sense that has been passed down to us to some extent in the 21st century. All right. So I guess the point that I'm trying to drive home here is that why do we not believe that there could be a proof for the existence of God? Maybe it's because none of the proofs are any good. That's a possibility. But it could also be because of the biases that our culture has passed down to us and to the rest of us, that says that that's not the kind of thing that you can do, right? Or should do. All right. So what does Gödel's theorem, this is the second conclusion, what does Gödel's theorem say about the nature of rationality and proof? Rationality, even in mathematics, cannot be completely objectified into a set of rules that everyone is obligated to believe. I think his theorem says you can't just codify rationality into a set of rules and come to conclusions that everyone is obligated to believe. All right? That's not the nature of it. The Enlightenment perspective that we can come to 100 absolute pure certainty through rational and reasons only, I think that is not the right way to think about rationality. It does not mean, however, that rationality is useless. Rationality was used, after all, to prove the incompleteness theorem. All right? So if you're throwing rationality out, then you have to throw out the incompleteness theorem because it was a proof and it was using rationality and so on and so forth. So I don't think you can say that rationality is useless, and that Gödel believed that there is still plenty of room for us to deepen and improve our rationality to tackle difficult problems. And I tend to agree with him on that. Okay. What implications does this have for the proof for the existence of God? I think the positions about rationality are based primarily on various cultural reactions and trends. They are the result of the spirit of the age, and as such, they should be carefully examined rather than uncritically adopted. Most of the reaction was against the idea that all men are intellectually obligated to believe a proof, which arose out of the Enlightenment. The solution to this problem is not to discuss, but to take the approach that a proof is an argument. If the argument convinces you, it is a proof. If the argument does not convince you, it's not a proof. So I would say that there is a place for rationality. It is possible, it seems to me, that one could someday come up with a proof for the existence of God. I don't think it's necessarily out of range possibility. I don't know. I'm not expert enough to follow the logic and all the axioms of all the complicated philosophical proof for the existence of God, so I can't say for sure whether I agree with all those things. But at least I would want to not say that it is categorical to do. And then I'm going to tag this last because we like to talk about sorts of things around here. That what if, and this is not really related to anything that I've said before, but what if Gödel's theorem was a good argument? What if it was a reasonable and rational proof for the existence of God? I think, in some sense, I know this is sort of contradicting what I've said, but I'm going to say it anyway. I don't know if anybody would actually be convinced by it, okay? Because belief in God is a matter of the will, not necessarily of the intellect. That no argument will ever convince a rebel, okay? And no logical argument is ultimately required for someone to be saved. So all I'm saying there, I'm not contradicting myself in the sense that I'm saying that there is no place for reason and rationality. I think there is definitely a place for reason and rationality. I'm just saying that when it comes to faith, usually there are other things going on than purely the intellect. All right. I have said a whole lot. So if you guys have questions, I will entertain them. Yes. Let's wait for the microphone. There you go.
It seems to me, is this on?
Is it on, Ron?
Yeah, you won't hear it out there, sister.
Okay. I remember Jack talking about this, and I thought he actually came up with a proof.
A proof for the existence of God?
I thought so. Do you remember?
I don't remember. I honestly, I do not remember exactly where he landed on that. I kind of thought that that at least when it came to Anselm's ontological argument, he didn't think that one was particularly compelling. But I may be mistaken there. I don't remember what he said, so
I
I
thought
can't
he'd
comment.
come up with his own, but like you said, I don't know that even if he had and it was true, that it would be convincing to anyone who was not inclined.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
But
yeah.
I just was wondering if you had remembered that.
I don't remember. Does anybody else remember what Jack's position is on this? I don't recall.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else have questions? Yeah.
I just wanted you to comment. You made a comment that postmodernist people have given up on rationality. Now that's in all contexts, right? Not just in mathematics or something like that. So, why do you think? What does that mean? Can you just expand
That's
on
kind
that?
of maybe an overbroad statement and could be easily misinterpreted. I guess the way I'm thinking about it is, again, there are other people that know this way better than I do, but my understanding is that the postmodern, one of the critiques of postmodernism, and I think it's actually there's some validity to this critique, is that people are working from a particular framework. A framework that they grew up in, a framework that they have adopted, that they have commitments to, a kind of a language, a kind of a structure, a way of thinking about things, a group, a set of axioms.
A set of
Yeah,
axioms.
maybe it's to some extent a set of axioms in some sense. And within that particular grouping or whatever, or that particular community or something like that, people have a way of thinking about things and coming to agreement. And then there are other groups over here that approaching things from really different set of starting points or a different cultural assumptions, a different language, a different way of thinking about things over here. And to some extent, there's kind of a disconnect between the two groups, all right? So one of the conclusions that can be drawn from this is that every group is sort of bound in some sense within their own cultural, linguistic context that they are in, and they're kind of stuck in that. So the idea that there is some overarching, true sort of perspective that is realistic and correspondent to the way reality is not something that the postmodern would want to agree to, because we're kind of more or less bound in some sense to our cultural and linguistic structures. And I think it is true that people do live in these structures. I just don't think that we're stuck in them quite as much as, say, a postmodernist would believe. So because of that, even your criteria for rationality, for instance, might be different from one group to another. And so the idea that rationality is the key and that we can use our reason and rationality to find that overarching truth that corresponds to the way things really are, I think the most postmodernists would sort of not want to go that direction. Does that help answer the question?
So would another way to say it is we're all limited? Well, all our knowledge is limited in some sense. It will always be limited in some sense. So it's pretty hard to make rational steps to come to some conclusion based on the fact that there's always a possibility that each step could be limited in its ability to prove or disprove.
Something really close to that.
Anytime
there's a number of nuances and distinctions that could be made with regard to that. But yeah, that's kind of the right direction, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for coming, and see you guys later.